Good afternoon, Jason Ellick, and welcome to the In This Together platform today. I'm very happy to have you in a call with me today. Jason Ellick, for everyone, is the senior expert at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And I'll probably let Jason at some point introduce what the Global Initiative is all about. But Jason has worked and is still working on a few projects in the context of on the continent. African continent, and which relates to the drug market and the networks happening occurring on the continent. So, Jason, welcome to the exchange, and thank you again. Perhaps my first question to you would be, again, what is this global initiative, and what is your overall experience? And then we can go a bit more in details on how you understand a bit the whole issue of drug trafficking at sea, the maritime networks, and specifically in the Indian Ocean and through Mauritius or Madagascar, all these little islands in the Indian Ocean. Would be very interested to know more from you. So over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lalini, and good welcome to everyone. Well, my name is Jason, and I work for an organization called the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Now, this is an organization that is based around the development of dialogue and evidence-based solutions with respect to transnational organized crime. We've got a global network of over 500 experts work with us and allow us to, I think, present objective evidence-based analysis around a variety of aspects, flows and streams of illicit criminal markets activity and groups. So my background, I've been involved in drugs in the sense of working for both the United Nations and a variety of other organizations. My focus is on markets, drug markets, their structures, their flows, and how they network around the world, from the origin of supply to meeting various demand characteristics. I've been working for nearly 30 years in the field, and my geographic focus is largely sub-Saharan Africa, Southern and Eastern Asia. So it's a great pleasure to have this discussion with you today, and I hope you get something out of it, or I hope we both get something out of this.
Thank you, Jason. So tell us a bit more about what your experience has been, the research that you've conducted, any possible gaps that you see of this network occurring in what we are specifically interested with is the Southern African route, obviously, but not necessarily just that route, is the connection also between Asia up to Latin America or anywhere else as a transit hub. Perhaps this is what we're interested with. So if you could share some of your conclusions, your work that you've noted over the past number of years that you're working in that region.
Sure. I think from a contextual point of view, we have to recognize a few things. The first is that the oceans, the maritime environment, is related to up to 90% of the world's trade. I mean, it's really an important part of the earth, are the seas. And when we talk about trade, we have to recognize that this is both licit, legal goods that are moving across in and through the oceans, but also illicit trade and goods that are classified as illegal. The majority of this trade, of course, is transiting on cargo vessels, particularly over the last 30 years, and the continued expansion in the ability of society to move large amounts of goods over the sea in these ever-growing and larger ships means that not only is it easier to move illicit goods, it's becoming a lot easier now for illicit goods like drugs, the smuggling of people, a variety of wildlife products and whatnot to move back and forth across the oceans in between the markets. If we look at the Western Indian Ocean area and the island regions in particular, we know that there's obviously a long history of trade from the Makran coast of southern Asia by Dhow along the eastern and southern coast of the continent, as well as through the islands there. And I think that's no deep revelation for anyone. What we know also is that in the last 30 years in particular, there's been a significant movement towards the trade in, or the movement in, illicit products, and in particular in drugs. And I'm talking here of heroin moving out of Afghanistan through Pakistan and Iran and traveling by Dhow in shipments of a ton or more to destinations along the eastern coast of and southern, and increasingly the southern coast of Africa. So in particular, you can look at the areas from Mombasa in Kenya through Zanzibar and the coastal regions of Tanzania to the northern coast, Cabo Delgado and Pemba in Mozambique, as being key places where these shipments are destined. Now, originally, these drugs were moved to these areas as a way of trying to circumvent enforcement that was increasing in overland routes going north from Afghanistan towards Europe. Europe, of course, is a major destination for heroin in particular, but also other drugs. We can think cocaine, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it was the movement of these drugs by sea through various ports and countries in Eastern and Southern Africa as a means of transiting them to European destinations, because it was felt that if a product was destined for Europe by air from an African airport or seaport even, it was seen as being less risky from a profile point of view than a product that was arriving from Pakistan or Iran or Afghanistan. It's a bit of camouflage, trying to hide the origin of the destination. And this has increased over the years. And as more and more drugs have been flowing through these routes, it's only natural that some smaller amount of these substances are calved off into the local communities. Drugs are not just something that can be consumed; they're also a currency. They're a method of payment, and it's common for payment to be made for a variety of things in drugs, whether it's heroin or something else. There is a long history in South Africa, west of Cape Town, for example, of Chinese syndicates exchanging precursor chemicals that are used to produce mandrax, which is a common drug that's smoked in South Africa, and later precursors, so chemicals that are used to produce methamphetamine, trading those for abalone that has been illegally fished. But this occurs in a variety of other contexts across the continent. And this, of course, then leads to drugs being available in the local community, because if you get paid in a mass of heroin and you don't smoke or use heroin, what are you going to do? You're going to have to sell it. And you're going to have to sell it to somebody else who's got the ability to sell it to people who want it. So you're going to begin to increase the availability of that substance in the community. People are going to use it and possibly introduce others to using it. Now, this is a long process, but this is how markets have begun to evolve in a lot of the Eastern and Southern African marketplaces. And we've got some publications around this. If you refer to our website, globalinitiative.net, you'll see a whole variety of research that we've done in the last 3 to 4 years that has documented this. Now, more specifically to the islands, I think it's fair to say that when we talk about the Eastern Indian Ocean region, we're essentially talking about a superhighway of trafficking. that there's a large volume of illicit products, not just drugs, but a variety of other illicitly traded goods. Think of ivory, think of other wildlife products that are moving from the continent or from Madagascar or other places. Think of people being moved who are moving, for example, maybe being smuggled into Mayotte or elsewhere. Think of arms being moved to the various conflict areas. Think of precious gems, stones, gold being moved back and forth across borders. Think of even things like cigarettes being moved to avoid taxes. So there's a wide amount of illicit trade that's occurring in this region. And it's using routes that have existed for many, 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 many years. Now, more recently, when we talk about something like heroin, we're looking more at high volume shipments moving out of the Southern Asian region towards the African continent and beyond. So in order to do that, we're looking at, and in order to navigate the open sea area, we're seeing larger and larger ships being used. So it's moving away from the dhows that have been hugging the coast and moving down, and more towards cargo vessels and hiding these shipments within the containers within a large container ship. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that enforcement has increased in the northern part of the Western Indian Ocean through the existence of Combined Task Force 150 and a variety of other naval initiatives that have occurred there. Now, those were developed on the basis of participating in the so-called war against terror. But each of these initiatives also have a large component related to interdicting the trafficking in narcotics on the basis that the money gained through this trafficking is supporting terrorist groups or terror-related activities. So this interdiction then has pushed some of the trafficking further out to sea, away from the coastal region in the eastern part of the continent, and further south onto the continent towards Mozambique and Madagascar. Madagascar is a great example of a location that has the ability to service a wide array of vessels. It's got major ports, of course, but it's got also a long history of its smaller ports and inlets and other parts of the island that enable it to accept vessels of even much smaller size. So when drugs are being shipped by a large vessel, think either a very large container ship or even a vessel that's larger than a dhow, but not to the point of being a container ship, a large fishing vessel, for example. It's common practice now, if the drugs are not moving through a port, and the way that the drugs move through a formal port is that the port is either corrupted or it's compromised. Corrupted meaning the officials are corrupt, so they accept bribes and they allow things to move, or compromised in the sense that people working for a particular trafficking syndicate have infiltrated the port and work inside the port, and then they enable the substances to move through. So it's one or the other or both. But larger shipments tend to move through smaller ports and informal locations. And this is done by jettisoning the cargo overboard and either floating it or sinking it with GPS coordinates that are then linked to people with smaller vessels. So think smaller fishing boats. And you would probably know that vessels smaller than 12 meters in length are not tracked using the common tracking system in the region. So it's extremely difficult for interdiction authorities to see this flotilla of smaller boats that go out and collect the substances and bring them back into beaches and other smaller ports, particularly in those areas that are also difficult to navigate because of reefs and other natural hazards. So you don't necessarily see large vessels coming in on a regular basis with a large container full of heroin and dock, and then the heroin container comes off. I think that's more of a movie plot than anything else. Although it does occur, as I said, because ports are compromised or corrupted. Another challenge, of course, is that when we monitor vessels in the region, We have the ability only to monitor vessels themselves, but not cargo. So we're tracking ships, but we don't have the ability to track cargo within the ships in the way that the various containers will move around as they transit the region. And this is particularly problematic because we have the ability in terms of interdicting only to profile containers and shipments and not necessarily vessels as a whole, because vessels contain hundreds of containers. Most ports in the region have the ability to scan or to look at a very small amount of containers. So if we use maybe the port in Mauritius, which is it St. Louis port?
Yes.
It has the ability to look at maybe only 3% of the containers. Now this is very small, and if you look at the evidence of corruption at the port in particular, and in some of the forwarding agencies that work out of that port, it's probably fair to say that very little of anything is ever discovered in the port, that a lot of this cargo simply moves through. And the excuse is used that we can only investigate 3% of containers, or maybe 5% of containers, and we're not able to identify those containers and put them through the X-ray facility because we lack the technical capacity or otherwise. So you've got a combination of corruption, compromised facilities, a lack of technical capacity, and an inability to have equipment to actually interdict in these cases.
Let me go back on a few issues that you mentioned, Jason. I mean, first of all, 90% of the world trade is maritime. That's very interesting what you mentioned. And also, I mean, you alluded to also these ships, larger ships, as you said, which is maybe a more recent trend, and less with those dhows that would be going out to sea. But these larger ships, so I would be maybe a bit more interested to know about, yes, of course, when there are container ships that come to port, and then there's all these difficulties and challenges that one would face in having to check all the containers and so forth. What about these boats that remain pretty much outside the EEZ of a country, and that are literally, again, on a way towards somewhere, and that might be, as you mentioned at some point, that there might be some smaller ships that are not necessarily tracked through the AIS, which may then at some point meet, and then again, through all kinds of GPS coordinate, drop something at sea. How is this trend also evolving in time because of all these controls that you mentioned? So obviously trafficker networks are finding all kinds of ways and all kinds of avenues to continue their market at different levels. So can you share maybe some of these trends with me, Jason?
Sure. It's one of the many challenges faced, particularly in this region, is exactly what you said, that a lot of this activity takes place outside of the EEZ of a particular state. Then this raises the question, who's responsible for enforcement? And not only that question, if we move a little further out and we even talk about the high seas themselves, not only who's responsible for enforcement, but who defines what is a crime and what is not. And this is a huge issue, because then who gives the clearance to actually declare a vessel necessary to be inspected and then boarded in these areas? And this is a problem. It's an added problem, and this brings a second issue up, when communication between traffickers and trafficking networks is far more efficient than communication between interdiction authorities. And if we use Mauritius as an example, I think it's a good example of national authorities that are responsible for organizing the national response around drug trafficking and interdicting trafficking networks that don't talk to each other, whether it's customs, whether it's police, whether it's whatever authority you want, port management, border control, whoever you want to talk about. And this was I mean, in Mauritius, we know from the 2018 report that it even went further than that and declared that ADSU should even be dismantled and replaced by a new body. And I think a lot of us look at the findings of that report as being quite forward-looking, but then look at the actions taken since that report. And I think only 2 of the recommendations have been taken up, one on cigarettes as currency and the other on postal orders in prisons, and wonder how serious the government was in its approach to this. And in fact, things seem to be going backwards in a way since the publication of that report. So it served to highlight that not only was communication bad within Mauritian authorities, but also between Mauritian authorities and the authorities of neighboring states, who couldn't and still are unsure whether they can trust sharing intelligence information with authorities from other areas, not just Mauritius, but states as well. And this is a big challenge in the region when the capacity of a lot of the interdiction forces across the region, pick a country, pick an island state, where they just don't have the ability or the knowledge necessary to undertake an operation against such well-organized and efficient networks like illicit drug trafficking networks. And when we bring in the issue of boundaries and borders and responsibility, jurisdiction, that just exacerbates the issue even further, and it becomes easier in a way to turn your head and just not look at things than to actually say, well, we need to find a solution to this and go forward. And not only find a solution, but we need to commit resources and political will to go forward and address this. And you're just not seeing this in the region right now.
That's very interesting. I think you also raised a very valid point, is the fact that it's not just one country, it's a cross-border cooperation there, because these networks are very well organized and very big networks, which are then also linked to so many different organized crimes, from drugs to arms to, as you mentioned, all kinds of goods being from human beings as well. So it's all intertwined together, which makes it difficult for one country to be able to manage that alone. So, I mean, my last question to you, Jason, is what is the perspective going forward? What are things that countries need to be looking at in fighting against this big, well-organized network at sea, which, as you said, is pretty much 90% of the world trade going on today? So what are some perspectives that you've been looking at and talking with countries about?
Well, there are a number of things. I think the first step is accepting the reality of the situation. And that is to accept that these challenges are real, that we're facing, that that things like corruption is a contributing factor to exacerbating the illicit drug situation in a particular country. It's only fair. And whether we're talking about maritime borders, or we're talking about, for example, the land border between South Africa and Mozambique, or Tanzania and Kenya, we're talking about places where monitoring and enforcement are weak at the very best. No country has the ability to monitor the entirety of its border. And it becomes even more difficult when you talk about island states. And we're looking at a situation today where things are only going to continue to get worse if we don't start addressing some of the primary challenges that we face. One of these, in addition to corruption, another one would be the lack of cooperation and the lack of intelligence sharing between countries. And some of this is down to corruption. Either the state themselves are corrupt and they don't want to participate in this, or they suspect bodies within their infrastructure are corrupt and they don't want to deal with it, to the point that they suspect other agencies are complicit in facilitating the trade that goes on, and they don't want to share information with them. The third issue is political will. I think this is an issue of particular interest to Mauritians because I really do think the 2018 report that came out was a really good document. It really did highlight the challenges that the country faced, and it really did propose some valid solutions that could have been explored. I think the big thing coming out of that is perhaps the elephant on the island, and that's how much corruption exists beyond this that is causing not only the report to largely be buried, but allowing the situation to continue to get worse. I mean, Mauritius has been and perhaps continues to be one of the largest heroin markets in all of Africa. If we look at the volume of use and the frequency of use there. Now that's just based on data, and I do have to say that we don't know a lot about markets across the rest of the continent, but there have been estimates, I think, of up to several, well, I'll say over 100,000 users at least, maybe 200,000 heroin users. Whether or not this is true is beside the point. The point is heroin's been used for a long time in Mauritius, and it's a very strong heroin market. So there's going to continue to be heroin coming into the country. The final point I'll make is that responding to illicit drug trafficking is not just going out and interdicting, is not just identifying supply chains and trying to disrupt them. It's also got to do with a lot of changes that have to happen within the country itself. And these center around addressing reasons why drug use is happening, structures that are in place that enable a drug market to continue to be facilitated. And these require, I think, considerations of policies that are in place as well. And you've seen changes in other countries around the world where countries where a lot more money has been spent on interdiction, and decisions have been made that they will focus more on trying to address the health impacts and social impacts of drug use, and less so on individual users and possession and things like that. And Mauritius was a leader in this. Mauritius was a leader for harm reduction. Mauritius, with needle syringe programming and all the other health issues that were in place, for a long time, Mauritius was held up as the leader in the continent and one of the leaders in the world in addressing this issue. Unfortunately, it's fallen back after recent political decisions. So going forward, challenges, yes, but if any place within the region is well established enough to make this progress, I do think it's Mauritius, because there's a history there of having done it already. The challenges faced today are largely political, recent political challenges. And if those can be overcome, then I think we're apt to see, again, some progress in Mauritius, and perhaps a lessening of the impact of this particular trade on the island as a whole.
Thank you very much, Jason. Maybe just a quick last one before we log off. What is your perception on how COVID has exacerbated perhaps this whole issue of drug trafficking in the maritime context, or drug trafficking in general? How is COVID creating a more important challenge, I think, to fight against? Obviously, because of the borders restricted for human beings, but not necessarily restricted for goods. How do you see COVID exacerbating currently the whole issue?
Well, first I'd have to say that geographically there are differences around the world, but generally speaking, COVID has not impacted maritime trade when it comes to illicit goods. So this is continuing. When it comes to border controls, we know that things designated as essential pass through very quickly. And trafficking networks are very good at taking advantage of these designations. We also know that law enforcement bodies are oriented around COVID and the prevention of infection and the maintenance of quarantine and lockdown, which means their attention that used to be faced on interdicting drug trafficking and identifying traffickers and networks is less today than it was before. So there's a lot of exploitation being undertaken by drug trafficking networks of the current situation in a variety of different ways. We've written a couple of reports about this. Again, they're available on our website. And we're seeing, particularly in the region, we're seeing very little impact in the retail markets on drugs from the COVID situation, with some exceptions. But it's fair to say that the illicit markets have prospered in the current environment, and our ability to interdict and respond has weakened.
Thank you so much, Jason, for this very insightful exchange. I'm sure the public in general will be very interested to hear your thoughts on this whole issue, which is, I think, concerning everyone, every country, as you said, and probably putting smaller countries more at risk and more vulnerable, and its populations in that regard as well. So I think there's a lot that we learned from you today, and we will encourage also some of the publications to encourage the public to have a look at all these publications that were done by the global initiatives, and we will put it online. So thanks a lot for that, Jason.
My pleasure.